September 1942. Major General Follett Bradley of the United States Army Air Forces stood in a cramped Moscow office studying reconnaissance photographs that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The images showed a city being methodically erased from existence. Stalingrad, an industrial center on the Volga River stretching nearly 30 miles along its western bank, was transforming into something unprecedented in modern warfare. A meat grinder where two ideologies would collide with such ferocity that military observers struggled to find adequate words to describe what they were witnessing. Bradley was part of a small American military mission in the Soviet Union, tasked with evaluating Soviet combat effectiveness and coordinating Lend-Lease aid. The mission operated under extraordinary constraints. Soviet paranoia meant constant surveillance, restricted movement, and limited access to accurate information. Yet what Bradley and his fellow observers were about to witness would fundamentally challenge every assumption American military planners held about warfare, logistics, and the limits of human endurance. The Germans, considered the world's most professional military force after 3 years of nearly unbroken victories, were about to be bled white in urban combat that defied every principle of modern war. And the Americans watching from the sidelines would learn lessons that would reshape their own military doctrine for generations. The battle had begun in late August 1942 when German 6th Army under General Friedrich Paulus, supported by 4th Panzer Army under General Hermann Hoth, launched their assault on the city. The objective was straightforward on paper: capture Stalingrad, cut Soviet supply lines along the Volga River, secure access to Caucasus oil fields that the German war machine desperately needed, and deliver a psychological blow that would break Soviet resistance. Stalin had ordered that the city bearing his name must not fall, making it a symbol of Soviet determination. The stage was set for a confrontation that would consume both armies and reshape the entire war. On August 23, 1942, the Luftwaffe launched one of the most devastating air raids of the war. Over 600 aircraft dropped thousands of tons of bombs on Stalingrad, creating a firestorm that killed an estimated 40,000 civilians in a single day. American observers reviewing intelligence reports compared it to the destruction of Rotterdam or Warsaw. The city's wooden structures burned like tinder. The Volga River itself seemed to be on fire, as oil storage tanks ruptured and spread burning fuel across the water. German commanders believed the bombing would break Soviet resistance, making the ground assault a simple mopping-up operation. They were catastrophically wrong. Lieutenant General John R. Dean, who would later head the U.S. military mission to Moscow, understood the challenges facing American observers in the Soviet Union. The Soviets, paranoid by nature and experience, viewed foreign military observers with deep suspicion. Even allies were potential spies who might reveal Soviet weaknesses to the enemy. American officers found themselves carefully monitored, their movements restricted, their questions often unanswered or answered with obvious propaganda. Major General John York, serving as a military attaché in 1942, managed to accomplish what few Western observers achieved. He reached the outskirts of Stalingrad in late October, becoming one of the few American officers to witness the battle firsthand. His journey from Moscow took weeks, navigating Soviet bureaucracy and military security that seemed designed to prevent foreign observation. York traveled by train to Saratov, then by truck convoy to observation positions north of the city. What he saw would form the basis of intelligence assessments that reached the highest levels of American military command. York's first glimpse of Stalingrad came from a hilltop position approximately 5 miles from the northern factory district. Through binoculars, he observed a scene that resembled medieval depictions of hell. The entire city appeared to be burning. Smoke columns rose thousands of feet into the autumn sky. The sound was unlike anything in his military experience, not the discrete explosions of conventional combat, but a continuous roar of artillery, bombs, machine guns, and collapsing structures that created an almost physical pressure in the air. Soviet officers accompanying York explained that the noise never stopped, day or night. The battle continued around the clock with an intensity that exhausted soldiers on both sides. York's initial dispatch to Washington, classified top secret and not declassified until the 1970s, was stark in its assessment. "We are witnessing combat on a scale and intensity that renders previous military experience obsolete. The Germans are fighting with characteristic efficiency, courage, and tactical skill. They are employing combined arms tactics that represent the pinnacle of modern military doctrine. Their artillery preparation is methodical and devastating. Their infantry advances are supported by armor, air power, and flamethrower units. By every conventional military standard, they should have captured this city weeks ago. They are losing." The American observers noted something that German commanders were slowly, painfully realizing through direct experience. Urban warfare negated every advantage the Wehrmacht had demonstrated in mobile operations across Europe and Russia. Tanks, the backbone of blitzkrieg tactics, became trapped in rubble-choked streets where they couldn't maneuver. Their armor, proof against anti-tank guns at range, became vulnerable to close-range attack by individual soldiers with magnetic mines, Molotov cocktails, and anti-tank rifles. German tankers reported Soviet soldiers crawling from ruins to attack tanks from above, dropping grenades into open hatches or setting fire to engine compartments. Air superiority, which had proven decisive in every previous German campaign, meant little when targets were buried in collapsed buildings and defenders sheltered in basements and sewers. Luftwaffe pilots reported difficulty identifying targets in the smoke and rubble. Soviet forces would shelter during air attacks, then emerge from underground positions to reoccupy defensive positions. German pilots dropped thousands of tons of bombs on Stalingrad, but the effect was often counterproductive. The bombing created more rubble, which provided better defensive positions for Soviet troops who had perfected fighting from ruins. Artillery, the traditional solution to fortified positions, could destroy structures, but couldn't dislodge defenders willing to fight from the rubble and then emerge when German infantry advanced. The Germans fired over 1 million shells into Stalingrad during the battle's course. They reduced buildings to shattered concrete and twisted steel, but Soviet soldiers, many of them former factory workers who knew every basement and utility tunnel, simply dug deeper and continued fighting. The Blitzkrieg, that devastating combination of armor, air power, and mobile infantry that had conquered Poland in weeks, France in months, and reached the gates of Moscow, was being dismantled block by bloody block in a city whose name would become synonymous with military disaster. York observed Soviet defensive tactics that seemed suicidal by American military standards, but proved devastatingly effective in practice. Small groups of soldiers, sometimes just 3 or 4 men, would occupy a ruined building or factory position and hold it against overwhelming German attacks. These tiny strongpoints, called islands by Soviet commanders, anchored defensive lines that bent but refused to break. German forces would advance hundreds of yards at tremendous cost in casualties and time, only to find themselves surrounded by Soviet positions they'd bypassed in their advance through the rubble. The defense of individual buildings became legendary. The Pavlov House, a 4-story apartment building near the city center, was defended by Sergeant Yakov Pavlov and a garrison that never exceeded 60 men. German forces attacked this single building for 58 days, losing more casualties, according to Soviet claims, than they had lost capturing Paris. While this specific claim was obvious propaganda that American observers recognized as exaggeration, the underlying reality was undeniable. Individual buildings were consuming German companies and battalions. American military doctrine emphasized mobility, firepower, and maintaining continuous front lines. The Soviet approach seemed to violate every principle of warfare that West Point taught. Soviet defensive positions were deliberately non-linear, creating a checkerboard pattern that allowed German forces to advance while leaving Soviet strongpoints in their rear. These bypassed positions would then attack German supply lines, communications, and reinforcements. German units found themselves fighting in three dimensions, battling enemies ahead, behind, below in sewers and basements, and sometimes above in damaged upper floors of buildings. The tactics required a level of small unit initiative that surprised American observers. Soviet military doctrine, heavily influenced by rigid Communist Party control, was generally considered inflexible and over-centralized. But in Stalingrad's ruins, Soviet junior officers and NCOs demonstrated remarkable tactical flexibility. Cut off from higher command, small units would hold positions independently for days, making tactical decisions without orders. When ammunition ran low, they would scavenge German weapons. When food ran out, they continued fighting. When reinforcements couldn't reach them, they recruited from wounded soldiers or civilian volunteers. Colonel Philip Faymanville, the U.S. Lend-Lease representative in Moscow, was tasked with understanding Soviet equipment losses and replacement needs. His office compiled reports from multiple sources, including Soviet requests for equipment, intelligence assessments, and interviews with Soviet officers. The numbers he assembled revealed the battle's true scale and painted a picture of industrial warfare on a level Americans had never contemplated. The Soviets were losing hundreds of artillery pieces monthly, thousands of vehicles, tens of thousands of small arms. Entire tank brigades were being destroyed and reformed multiple times during the battle's course. Yet, somehow, impossibly, production continued even as German forces captured factories. Soviet workers, many of them women and teenagers, assembled T-34 tanks in workshops under German shell fire. The Dzerzhinsky tractor factory, converted to tank production before the war, continued operating even after German forces captured portions of the facility. Workers would assemble tanks in the sections they still controlled, drive them directly from assembly lines into combat against German forces literally hundreds of yards away, and often crew them themselves when trained tankers weren't available. Faymanville compiled detailed reports on Soviet industrial mobilization that American planners found both impressive and disturbing. The Soviets had evacuated entire factories from Western territories threatened by German advance, moving machinery, workers, and their families thousands of miles east to the Urals and Siberia. These factories were producing equipment within weeks of reassembly, operating in facilities that were barely more than wooden sheds in sub-zero temperatures. Workers labored 12 to 16-hour shifts, 7 days a week, producing the weapons that kept Soviet forces fighting. The quality of Soviet equipment varied dramatically, but quantity compensated for individual deficiencies. American observers noted that Soviet tanks, while crude by American standards, were produced in numbers that overwhelmed German forces. The T-34 medium tank, which American experts considered inferior to German Panthers or American Shermans in many respects, was being produced at rates exceeding all German tank production combined. Soviet artillery, using standardized calibers and simple designs, could be manufactured rapidly and deployed in massed batteries that created devastating firepower. By November 1942, the fighting had concentrated in Stalingrad's northern factory district, an area that would become the battle's most infamous killing ground. The Dzerzhinsky tractor factory, the Barakati gun factory, and the Red October steel plant were massive industrial complexes covering square miles. Their heavy machinery, thick walls, and maze-like layouts made them natural fortresses. German forces needed to capture these factories to reach the Volga River and complete Stalingrad's conquest. Soviet forces were determined to hold them regardless of cost. Major General Sidney P. Spaulding, who visited the Volga River crossing points in December 1942, observed the lifeline that kept Soviet forces in the factory district fighting: The scene defied belief and challenged every conventional understanding of logistics. Under constant German artillery fire and air attack, small boats, rafts, ferries, and even chunks of ice capable of supporting a few soldiers crossed the ice-choked river carrying ammunition, food, and reinforcements to the embattled city. The river itself was over a mile wide at Stalingrad, providing little cover from German observation posts on the western bank's higher ground. Spaulding watched the crossing operations from Soviet positions on the eastern bank, observing a logistics system that operated through sheer force of will and acceptance of catastrophic casualties. Boats and rafts would push off from the eastern shore, typically carrying 20 to 30 soldiers along with ammunition and food. German artillery observers would spot them within minutes and call in fire. The river would erupt with shell splashes, machine gun fire would sweep the water, and Luftwaffe aircraft would strafe anything that moved. Many boats never completed the crossing. Those that did often arrived with half their passengers killed or wounded. The return journey carried wounded soldiers being evacuated from the city. Spaulding watched barges loaded with hundreds of wounded men pushing off from the western bank, many sinking under German fire before reaching safety. Soviet officers told him that casualties among river transport crews exceeded 70%. Boat pilots, sailors, and engineers knew they were unlikely to survive more than a few crossings. Yet volunteers kept coming, often civilians from river towns who knew how to handle boats but had no military training. They would make one crossing, perhaps two, then disappear into the statistics of war. Supplies that successfully crossed the Volga still faced the challenge of moving through the city to forward positions. Soviet forces controlled a strip of land along the riverbank that in some places was less than 300 yards deep. German positions overlooked every approach route. Supplies moved at night through rubble-filled streets under constant fire. Soviet soldiers would carry ammunition and food forward individually, crawling through ruins to avoid German observation. A journey of half a mile from the riverbank to a forward position could take hours and cost multiple casualties. Despite these obstacles, Soviet logistics, while primitive by American standards, proved brutally effective. American observers noted a crucial factor that German intelligence had fatally underestimated. While German supply lines stretched hundreds of miles across hostile territory, vulnerable to partisan attack, weather, and the sheer friction of distance, Soviet forces drew supplies from factories mere miles away on the Volga's eastern bank or from facilities deeper in Soviet territory. Even as the western bank burned, Soviet factories east of the Volga continued producing ammunition and equipment that reached frontline units within hours. The ammunition expenditure in Stalingrad staggered American military planners accustomed to carefully rationed artillery fire. Soviet artillery batteries would fire thousands of rounds in single bombardments, consuming ammunition at rates that American logistics officers considered unsustainable. Yet the bombardments continued, day after day, week after week. The Soviets were demonstrating a fundamental principle of industrial warfare. In a total war economy mobilized for survival, production capacity mattered more than efficiency or cost. By mid-November 1942, American military intelligence had identified something that German commanders were just beginning to suspect through fragmentary reports and ominous silence from their flanks. Soviet forces were massing north and south of Stalingrad in unprecedented numbers. Colonel Ivan Yeaton, military attaché in Moscow and one of the few American officers with significant intelligence sources in the Soviet Union, compiled reports from multiple channels indicating a massive Soviet counteroffensive was imminent. Yeaton's sources included diplomatic contacts, intercepted communications, railroad traffic analysis, and careful observation of Soviet behavior in Moscow. Soviet officials, normally anxious and defensive when discussing military situations, had grown quietly confident in early November. Requests for lend-lease equipment shifted from defensive items like anti-tank guns to offensive weapons like trucks and fuel. Soviet officers who had been pessimistic about Stalingrad's fate suddenly spoke of imminent victory. Most tellingly, Soviet units were being pulled from quiet sectors and disappearing from intelligence reports, suggesting major redeployments. Yeaton's assessment, delivered to Washington on November 15th, predicted with remarkable accuracy that the Germans were about to be encircled. His report noted several factors that pointed toward imminent Soviet offensive action. First, German Sixth Army's flanks were protected by Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian forces that were less capable than German units and poorly equipped for Russian winter warfare. Second, German forces were exhausted from months of intense combat and couldn't maintain defenses along hundreds of miles of front line while simultaneously fighting in Stalingrad. Third, Soviet force concentrations in rear areas suggested offensive preparations on a massive scale. American intelligence officers in Washington studied Yeaton's assessment with interest but some skepticism. The Soviets had launched multiple counteroffensives earlier in 1942 that had failed with heavy losses. German mobile warfare doctrine emphasized rapid response to breakthrough attempts. Even if the Soviets achieved initial success, German panzer reserves would likely contain and eliminate any penetration. The consensus in Washington was that Soviet attacks might cause the Germans temporary difficulties but wouldn't fundamentally alter the strategic situation. Operation Uranus, launched on November 19, 1942, proved Yeaton's analysis correct, with terrifying precision that shocked German commanders and impressed American observers. Soviet forces attacked from north and south simultaneously, smashing through Romanian Third and Fourth Armies that buckled under overwhelming assault. Soviet tank columns exploited the breakthroughs with speed and aggression that reminded American observers of German blitzkrieg tactics. Within 4 days, Soviet pincers met at Kalach, trapping German Sixth Army and portions of Fourth Panzer Army in a pocket centered on Stalingrad. American observers watching from Moscow recognized immediately that they were witnessing a turning point in the war. The Wehrmacht, previously considered invincible in mobile operations, was now surrounded and fighting for survival in the ruins they had created. Over 250,000 German and Axis troops were trapped in a pocket approximately 30 miles long and 20 miles wide, supplied only by air across hundreds of miles of Soviet-controlled territory, facing a Russian winter without adequate shelter, food, or fuel. General Dean's reports to Washington emphasized the strategic implications with analysis that would prove remarkably prescient. The German Sixth Army is among the Wehrmacht's finest formations, containing experienced divisions that have fought from France to the Volga. Its destruction will represent not merely a tactical defeat but a psychological catastrophe for German arms that will reverberate through Axis nations and neutral countries observing the war's progress. Germany's allies will question the value of their partnership with a power that cannot protect its own elite forces. Neutral nations will reassess the likely war outcome. More significantly, Dean continued, the Soviets had demonstrated operational capabilities. American intelligence had not credited them with possessing. The double envelopment was a complex maneuver requiring precise timing, effective command and control, operational security to achieve surprise, and aggressive exploitation of breakthrough. The Soviets had executed all these elements successfully against a highly professional opponent. This suggested that Soviet military competence, while uneven, was higher than American assessments had concluded. The Red Army was learning from its defeats and developing into a formidable fighting force. American military planners studying Operation Uranus identified several factors contributing to Soviet success. First, the Soviets had achieved complete surprise despite massing over 1 million soldiers for the offensive. German intelligence had failed to detect the scale of Soviet preparations, a remarkable counterintelligence achievement. Second, Soviet forces had demonstrated improved tactical skills in breakthrough operations, using artillery preparation followed by combined armor and infantry assault that overwhelmed defensive positions. Third, Soviet operational tempo had prevented German forces from establishing coherent defensive lines during the exploitation phase. The encirclement of Sixth Army created a strategic dilemma for German high command that American observers recognized as essentially unsolvable. Hitler's order that Sixth Army must hold Stalingrad prevented breakout attempts that might have saved the force. The decision to supply the pocket by air committed resources to an impossible task. The planned relief operation would require forces Germany didn't have available while weakening defenses elsewhere. Every option facing German planners was bad. They were reduced to choosing between different forms of disaster. The attempted supply of encircled Sixth Army by air became one of the war's great logistics disasters, and a case study American Air Force planners would reference for decades. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, commanding the Luftwaffe, promised Hitler that air supply could sustain Sixth Army until relief forces broke through. Göring's promise, based more on political considerations and personal arrogance than realistic assessment, condemned German transport aviation to catastrophic losses while dooming the trapped army to slow starvation. Colonel Faymonville, whose Lend-Lease responsibilities required detailed understanding of logistics, compiled a comprehensive analysis of the airlift's feasibility that proved devastatingly accurate. His report, circulated to American military planners in late November 1942, demolished Göring's promises with mathematical precision. Sixth Army required approximately 500 tons of supplies daily to maintain combat effectiveness. This included food for over 250,000 men, ammunition for continued fighting, fuel for vehicles and generators, medical supplies for thousands of wounded, and winter clothing for soldiers inadequately equipped for Russian winter. Delivering 500 tons daily required approximately 250 Junkers, Ju-52 transport flights, assuming each aircraft delivered 2 tons and flew 1 round trip daily. This assumed perfect weather, no aircraft losses to Soviet anti-aircraft fire or fighters, functioning airfields within the pocket, adequate ground crews and fuel at forward bases, and no mechanical failures. None of these assumptions proved realistic. Soviet anti-aircraft defenses around Stalingrad were formidable and growing stronger as more weapons were brought forward. Soviet fighters, including American-supplied P-39 Airacobras and British Hurricanes along with Soviet Yak-9s and LA-5s, attacked German transports mercilessly. Weather in December and January was frequently below minimums for safe flight. The Luftwaffe was averaging less than 100 tons delivered daily, even on good flying days when weather permitted operations. Many days saw 0 deliveries as blizzards grounded all aircraft. Soviet anti-aircraft fire and fighters were destroying German transport aircraft faster than they could be replaced. The Ju-52s, slow and unarmored, were helpless against fighters. He-111 bombers, pressed into transport service, carried less cargo and were equally vulnerable. The few 4-engine FW-200 Condor aircraft available could carry more supplies, but were prioritized for other missions and too valuable to risk over Stalingrad. American observers noted that the Germans were compounding their error by continuing the airlift long after its failure was obvious. Luftwaffe transport crews, among the most experienced in the German Air Force, were being sacrificed in an operation everyone recognized was doomed. These crews represented irreplaceable experience and training that Germany desperately needed for other operations. Their loss would cripple German air transport capability for the war's remainder, affecting supply operations in North Africa, the Mediterranean, and later the Eastern Front. The psychological impact of the failed airlift on trapped soldiers was devastating. German troops in the pocket watched for supply aircraft with desperate hope, knowing that survival depended on those fragile lifelines. When aircraft failed to arrive because of weather or Soviet action, despair spread through the ranks. When drops occurred, soldiers mobbed the landing zones, sometimes fighting each other for food and ammunition. Officers reported that unit discipline was eroding as starving men became increasingly desperate. The attempted relief operation, Operation Winter Storm, launched on December 12th under Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, fascinated American observers as a case study in what happens when brilliant operational planning meets insufficient resources and flawed strategic assumptions. Manstein's reputation as Germany's finest operational commander was well established. He had planned the invasion of France, conducted successful operations in the Crimea, and was considered the master of mobile warfare. If anyone could rescue Sixth Army, conventional wisdom suggested it would be Manstein. American intelligence officers studied Manstein's relief operation with professional interest, recognizing a masterclass in crisis management under impossible conditions. Manstein assembled Army Group Dawn from divisions pulled from other sectors, including the 4th Panzer Army under General Hermann Hoth that had participated in Stalingrad's initial assault. The plan called for a rapid thrust from the south to break through Soviet encirclement lines and establish a supply corridor to the trapped 6th Army. Once connected, supplies would flow into the pocket while 6th Army withdrew westward to escape encirclement. The relief force advanced to within 30 miles of Stalingrad's perimeter before being stopped by Soviet forces that seemed to appear from nowhere. American observers noted that Soviet intelligence had identified Manstein's preparations and deployed forces to intercept the relief attempt. Soviet units fighting at Stalingrad included some of the Red Army's best formations, battle-hardened through months of intense combat. They employed defensive tactics learned from the Germans themselves, creating defense in depth that traded space for time while inflicting maximum casualties on attacking forces. What impressed American analysts was the Soviet ability to fight simultaneously on multiple axes. While holding Stalingrad itself against continued German assaults, Soviet forces blocked Manstein's relief attempt from the south and launched new offensives threatening German positions along the entire southern front. This demonstrated operational sophistication and resource management that exceeded previous Soviet performance. The Red Army was coordinating operations across hundreds of miles of front, shifting reserves between threatened sectors and maintaining pressure everywhere simultaneously. Manstein's panzers advanced with characteristic German skill, penetrating Soviet defensive lines and destroying counterattacking forces, but each success cost casualties and consumed fuel and ammunition that couldn't be replaced. Soviet resistance stiffened with each passing day. Fresh Soviet divisions appeared in front of German forces, those endless reinforcements fed by that relentless Soviet logistics pipeline. American observers monitoring the relief operation recognized that Manstein faced an impossible task. He was conducting offensive operations in Russian winter with inadequate forces against an opponent that could trade space for time and replace losses faster than he could inflict them. The relief operation's failure sealed Sixth Army's fate and demonstrated limits of German operational skill. Manstein, for all his brilliance, couldn't overcome fundamental strategic realities. Germany lacked sufficient forces to break through determined Soviet resistance while simultaneously holding hundreds of miles of front line. The Luftwaffe couldn't supply the pocket or provide adequate air support to ground forces. Soviet resistance was strengthening while German strength eroded. By late December, Manstein recommended that Hitler authorize Sixth Army to attempt breakout, recognizing that relief from outside was no longer feasible. Hitler's refusal to authorize breakout condemned Sixth Army to destruction. American observers noted this as a critical failure in German command structure. The Führer, lacking military training but wielding absolute authority, overruled professional military advice based on political and psychological considerations rather than military reality. This command dysfunction would characterize German strategic decision-making for the war's remainder, with professional military judgment subordinated to Hitler's increasingly erratic directives. Through December 1942 and January 1943, American observers watched the slow strangulation of German Sixth Army through intelligence reports, intercepted communications, and Soviet briefings that grew increasingly triumphant. The picture that emerged was of an army dying by inches, maintaining military discipline and continuing to fight even as supplies dwindled, cold and hunger killed thousands, and hope evaporated. Intelligence intercepts provided glimpses into conditions inside the pocket that shocked American observers despite their professional detachment. German radio communications, initially disciplined and operational, gradually took on desperate tones. Requests for supplies became pleas. Medical officers reported casualties from frostbite exceeding combat wounds. Unit commanders reported soldiers too weak from hunger to man defensive positions. The intercepts painted a picture of an army consuming itself, burning its last reserves of strength to continue fighting an unwinnable battle. By early January, conditions inside the pocket had deteriorated beyond American observers' worst projections. German soldiers were receiving one-third normal rations, approximately 200 calories daily, far below the minimum required for survival in Russian winter while conducting combat operations. Men were starving to death while manning defensive positions. Frostbite casualties overwhelmed medical facilities that lacked supplies to treat them. Wounded soldiers died from infections that peacetime would consider trivial. The horse population, over 50,000 animals at encirclement start, was systematically slaughtered for food as the Germans ate their transportation and last hope of mobility. Ammunition shortages forced German commanders to carefully ration fire, restricting artillery to defensive fires only and limiting machine gun bursts to conserve rounds. Fuel was exhausted, leaving tanks and vehicles immobile, converted to static pillboxes. Medical supplies were critically short, with surgery performed without anesthesia and amputations conducted with carpenter's saws. Yet through all this, German soldiers continued fighting with discipline that American observers found both admirable and horrifying. Soviet forces, recognizing that time and attrition were destroying the trapped army, maintained constant pressure without launching the climactic assault that might have ended the battle earlier. American observers noted this as sound military strategy. Why accept heavy casualties storming desperate defenders when winter, hunger, and ammunition shortages were methodically destroying German combat power? The Soviets tightened the encirclement gradually, capturing outlying positions and shrinking the pocket while German strength eroded daily. The psychological impact on German soldiers was profound and would leave permanent scars on survivors. Intelligence intercepts and prisoner interrogations revealed soldiers who had lost faith not just in the war's outcome, but in their leadership's competence and concern for their welfare. The sense of abandonment was pervasive. Soldiers felt they had been sacrificed for political considerations, ordered to hold an indefensible position for symbolic reasons while Germany's leaders lived in comfortable headquarters hundreds of miles away. Colonel Yeaton, interviewing German prisoners captured during the battle's final phase, found men broken physically and psychologically. Many had lost 30 or 40 pounds from their pre-encirclement weight. Frostbite had claimed fingers, toes, ears, and noses. Diseases including typhus, dysentery, and pneumonia ravaged the pocket's population, but the psychological damage ran deeper. These men had believed themselves part of an invincible military machine. Stalingrad had revealed that invincibility as myth and exposed their leaders as fallible, their cause as potentially doomed. The effect on Wehrmacht morale extended far beyond Stalingrad itself. German soldiers fighting elsewhere, hearing news of Sixth Army's fate through official communiques and unofficial soldier networks, recognized that victory was no longer certain. If Sixth Army could be destroyed, no German force was safe. The mythology of German military superiority, carefully cultivated through years of victories and propaganda, had been shattered in Stalingrad's ruins. Doubt, previously unthinkable, began eroding confidence throughout German ranks. The final Soviet offensive into the pocket began on January 10, 1943. After a massive artillery preparation that consumed thousands of tons of ammunition, Soviet forces attacked from all directions, systematically crushing German resistance. The Germans, with virtually no ammunition, no fuel, and soldiers too weak from hunger to mount effective defense, collapsed quickly. The pocket split into smaller segments, isolated from each other and command control. On January 31st, Field Marshal Paulus, promoted by Hitler to a rank no German field marshal had ever surrendered from, became a Soviet prisoner. His surrender was calculated humiliation orchestrated by Hitler to emphasize the shame of defeat. The last German forces in northern Stalingrad surrendered on February 2, 1943, ending the battle after more than 5 months of combat that consumed 2 armies and a city. The final count of prisoners shocked even hardened observers. Approximately 91,000 German and Axis soldiers marched into Soviet captivity from an army that had numbered over 250,000 4 months earlier. The difference between starting strength and prisoner total represented soldiers killed in combat, dead from starvation and disease, or missing in the frozen rubble. The American military mission in Moscow was invited to observe captured German equipment and interview selected prisoners. A rare concession, revealing Soviet confidence in their victory and desire to impress their Western allies. General Dean visited prisoner assembly points and equipment collection areas, documenting the battle's cost in human and material terms. The prisoners, he observed, barely resembled soldiers. They were walking skeletons wrapped in rags and blankets, stumbling through snow with dead eyes and frost-damaged extremities. Many would not survive the march to prisoner-of-war camps. The captured equipment revealed the scale of German material losses. Thousands of artillery pieces, hundreds of tanks and vehicles, mountains of small arms and equipment lay scattered across the battlefield or collected in Soviet salvage dumps. Much of it was damaged or destroyed, but the sheer quantity demonstrated the Wehrmacht's investment in Stalingrad's capture and the magnitude of its defeat. American ordnance experts examining captured weapons noted that German equipment was generally excellent in quality but insufficient in quantity. Soviet equipment, while often cruder, existed in numbers that overwhelmed German advantages. General Dean's assessment of the battle's strategic implications, delivered to the Joint Chiefs of Staff in February 1943, proved remarkably prescient and shaped American strategic planning for the war's remainder. Stalingrad represents the Wehrmacht's high watermark on the Eastern Front. German casualties, approximately 500,000 killed, wounded, or captured in the battle and related operations, cannot be replaced. Germany faces manpower shortages that will only worsen as the war continues. More critically, the mystique of German military superiority has been destroyed. Soviet forces have demonstrated they can match German operational skills while leveraging superior numbers and industrial capacity. The strategic initiative, Dean continued, had shifted irreversibly to the Soviet Union. Germany was now forced into strategic defensive, reacting to Soviet moves rather than driving events. Future German offensives would be limited in scope and objective, attempting to stabilize front lines rather than achieve decisive victory. The Soviets, having survived Germany's best offensive efforts, would now launch offensives of their own with growing strength and sophistication. The question was no longer whether Germany could win in the East, but how long Germany could avoid losing. American observers noted another crucial factor that would influence subsequent Allied strategy. The battle had consumed resources Germany desperately needed elsewhere. The attempt to capture Stalingrad had diverted forces that could have secured Caucasus oil fields or reinforced North Africa, where the Africa Corps was fighting for survival against British and American forces. The subsequent relief attempts had consumed Germany's strategic reserves at a time when they faced mounting threats on multiple fronts. Stalingrad hadn't just cost Germany an army. It had bankrupted their strategic position by committing forces to an objective whose symbolic value exceeded its military worth.